Montana Territory, 1884. Snow drifted across the empty platform of the Pinecrest station as Thomas Calloway stamped his boots against the cold. At 26, he'd already spent more years herding cattle than most men twice his age. Yet here he stood, chilled to the bone and questioning his own sanity for the 100th time that morning. "Train's running late again," muttered the station master, a gray-bearded man who barely looked up from his telegraph. "Christmas weather slowing everything down." Thomas nodded, pulling his sheepskin coat tighter as another gust of wind cut through the platform. He'd spent the last 7 years convincing himself that a man needed nothing but open sky, good horses, and enough work to keep his hands busy. Love was a luxury the frontier didn't afford working cowboys, especially not orphaned ones with nothing to their name, but a small herd and a half-built cabin. The mountains surrounding Pinecrest had been his only constant companions since his parents died from fever when he was 19. He'd buried them side by side on the small homestead they'd staked, then thrown himself into the back-breaking work of building something from nothing. The neighboring ranchers respected his grit, hiring him for seasonal work while he slowly grew his own modest herd. "You expecting somebody, Calloway?" the station master asked, eyeing the wrapped package tucked under Thomas's arm. "Just picking up some supplies," Thomas lied, not wanting to admit he'd ridden 12 miles through snow for a Christmas wish that seemed more foolish with each passing minute. The truth was buried in the letters he kept folded in his breast pocket. 3 months of correspondence with a woman he'd never met. Naomi Lawson, 22 years old, answering his hesitant advertisement in an Eastern newspaper. A mail-order bride arrangement that had begun as a practical solution to his loneliness, but had somehow evolved into something that made his heart race whenever he saw an envelope bearing her delicate handwriting. The distant whistle of the approaching train pulled Thomas from his thoughts. His pulse quickened as he squared his shoulders and brushed snow from his hat. In her last letter, she described herself clearly: blonde hair, blue eyes, and standing at 5'4". He'd memorized every detail, though he told himself it was only to ensure he'd recognize her. What he couldn't admit, not even to himself, was that he'd already begun dreaming of a woman whose face he'd never seen. The locomotive chugged into the station, belching steam that momentarily obscured the platform. Thomas stood rigidly, clutching the small wrapped gift, a silver brooch he'd saved 3 months to purchase. As passengers began disembarking, doubt crashed over him in waves. Who was he to think a woman from Philadelphia would want a life in the Montana wilderness with a man who had nothing but calloused hands and stubborn dreams? Thomas had nearly convinced himself to leave when he saw her. Standing uncertainly at the steps of the passenger car, Naomi Lawson surveyed the small frontier station with apprehensive eyes. Her blonde hair was swept up beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched her traveling dress. At 22, her face still carried youth's softness, though there was something in her eyes that spoke of determination beyond her years. Their gazes met across the platform, and for a heartbeat, the frontier disappeared. The cold, the distance he'd maintained from others, the belief that men like him weren't meant for happiness, it all wavered like a mirage. "Mr. Calloway?" she asked, approaching with small steps that betrayed her nervousness. "Miss Lawson," he replied, removing his hat. "Welcome to Pinecrest." She smiled tentatively, and Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the wall he'd built around his heart. "I was beginning to fear you might not come," she admitted, her accent refined but her voice warm. "I gave my word," Thomas answered simply, realizing as he said it that he'd been standing on that platform for nearly 2 hours, unwilling to break that promise even as doubt had gnawed at him. As Thomas helped load her trunks onto his wagon, Naomi surveyed the snow-covered mountains surrounding them. "It's beautiful," she said, "and much bigger than I imagined." "It can be harsh," Thomas warned, feeling obligated to be honest. "Winter's just beginning. The snow will get deeper, the days shorter. Many find it too lonely." Naomi's blue eyes studied him with unexpected directness. "I didn't come all this way seeking ease, Mr. Calloway. I came seeking a future." Something in her quiet certainty silenced Thomas as he helped her onto the wagon bench. As they set off toward his homestead, he couldn't help but notice how she didn't flinch from the bitter wind, instead leaning forward slightly as though eager to meet whatever lay ahead. Thomas had expected her to be overwhelmed by the primitive conditions of frontier life, But as they approached his cabin nestled against the foothills, Naomi's expression held more curiosity than dismay. The structure was modest, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, a small barn beside it for livestock. But he'd spent the past month making improvements, adding a proper wooden floor and glass windows in anticipation of her arrival. "This is yours?" she asked as he brought the wagon to a halt. "Ours," he corrected automatically, then flushed. "That is, if you decide to stay. The arrangement gives you 3 months to be certain." Naomi stepped down from the wagon, her gaze taking in the snow-covered pasture beyond the cabin and the line of pine trees that marked the boundary of his claim. "Your letters mentioned cattle," she said. 38 head, Thomas replied. "Not much compared to the big outfits, but they're healthy stock. Another few years, and we could have over 100. We," she repeated softly, testing the word. Thomas couldn't read her expression as she surveyed what he had to offer. 7 years of backbreaking work had yielded a small holding that still felt tenuous in the face of Montana's unforgiving seasons. "There's coffee inside," he offered, suddenly desperate to show her he wasn't completely uncivilized. "And I've prepared the second room for you. It has its own door. You'll have your privacy until—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Naomi surprised him with a small smile. "Until we decide if we suit," she completed for him. "That seems sensible, Mr. Calloway." Inside, the cabin was warmer than expected, thanks to the fire Thomas had stoked before leaving for the station. Naomi removed her bonnet, revealing the full glory of her blonde hair, nearly white gold in the firelight. She moved with careful grace, taking in the rough-hewn furniture Thomas had crafted himself, a table with 4 chairs, hoping someday they might be filled, a bookshelf containing the few volumes he'd inherited from his parents, the braided rug before the hearth. "You have books," she said with genuine pleasure, running her fingers along the spines. "Not many," Thomas admitted. "My mother was a schoolteacher before coming west." Naomi selected a volume of Wordsworth poetry. "Mine as well," she said quietly. Before the fever took her, the simple connection hung between them, both orphaned by the same merciless illness that swept through communities with no regard for wealth or standing. Thomas realized he knew this about her from her letters, but hearing her speak of it made the shared experience tangible. "I've brought some books with me," she added, gesturing toward her trunk. "And seeds for a vegetable garden when spring comes." The matter-of-fact way she projected herself into a future here startled Thomas. During the months of their correspondence, he had focused on practical matters, the climate, the work required, the isolation she would face. She had responded with equally practical questions and assurances, but now he wondered if she truly understood what life here would mean. "Miss Lawson," he began carefully, "I want to be certain you understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't Philadelphia. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles away. Winter storms can isolate us for weeks. There are no concerts, no shops." "Mr. Calloway," she interrupted gently, "I didn't leave a life of luxury. After my father's passing, I worked as a seamstress in a factory where the air was so thick with lint I could barely breathe. I shared a room with 4 other women and had no prospects beyond a life of servitude or marrying a man my father's age who needed a housekeeper more than a wife." Her candor stunned him into silence. "I came west because I want a life that belongs to me," she continued. "Your letters spoke of building something. That's what I want as well. I have no illusions about the difficulties." As evening settled over the cabin, Thomas prepared a simple meal while Naomi unpacked her few possessions. The domesticity of having another person moving about his home felt foreign yet strangely right. They ate by lamplight, the silence between them gradually softening from awkward to comfortable. "I have something for you," Thomas said finally, retrieving the small package he'd carried to the station. "A Christmas welcome, though Christmas is still 2 weeks away." Naomi unwrapped the silver brooch with careful fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her thumb over the delicate floral design. "It's not much," Thomas said, suddenly embarrassed by the modest gift. "It's perfect." She pinned it to her collar, then reached into her own bag. "I have something for you as well." The gift she placed in his hands was wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside, Thomas found a finely knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "I made it during the journey," she explained. "I noticed in your letters you never mentioned warm accessories, only your coat." Thomas stared at the practical gift, overwhelmed by the realization that while traveling across the country to meet a stranger, she had spent hours creating something specifically for him. The thoughtfulness of it threatened to undo him completely. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough. That night, retiring to their separate rooms, Thomas lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his home. For 7 years, he'd told himself that self-reliance was the frontier's only currency, that attachment was a weakness no cowboy could afford. Yet in the space of a day, Naomi's quiet presence had awakened questions he'd buried beneath work and solitude. Dawn broke with fresh snow falling, and Thomas rose early to tend the livestock. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found Naomi already awake, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I wanted to make myself useful." "Not at all," Thomas replied, struck by how naturally she moved through his kitchen, as though she belonged there. Over the following days, they established a cautious rhythm. Thomas showed Naomi the workings of the homestead, the spring that provided their water, the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the root cellar dug into the hillside. She absorbed everything with practical interest, asking questions that revealed her determination to understand this new life. In the evenings, they gradually shared their histories. Thomas spoke of his parents' dreams for the homestead, the cattle drive where he'd earned enough to buy his first breeding stock, the harsh winter 3 years prior when he'd nearly lost everything to cold and wolves. Naomi told him of her father's failed business ventures, the cramped tenement where she'd lived after his death, the advertisement for mail-order brides she'd spotted while delivering a mended shirt to a newspaper editor. "What made you choose my letter?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat before the fire. "You must have had other offers." Naomi considered the question, her fingers busy with mending one of his shirts. "3 others," she admitted. "A shopkeeper in Ohio, a widower with 4 children in Nebraska, and a banker in California." Thomas waited, unsure he wanted to hear her reasoning. "Your letter was honest," she continued. "You didn't promise riches or comfort. You wrote about building something that would last, about the beauty of this land despite its harshness." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "And you mentioned sending for books if I had favorites. That small consideration told me something about your character." The simple explanation humbled Thomas. He'd written that letter sitting at this very table, convinced no woman of sense would respond to such meager offerings. Yet she had seen something in his words that he himself hadn't recognized, a loneliness he'd disguised even from himself, and a willingness to make room in his life for another's needs. As Christmas approached, the weather turned bitter. Thomas spent long hours ensuring the cattle had access to feed and water, often returning with ice in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. Naomi began meeting him with hot coffee and stew ready on the stove, the cabin kept warm and orderly in his absence. On the 5th day after her arrival, Thomas returned to find Naomi struggling to repair a broken chair. Her fingers were red from effort, her face furrowed in concentration as she attempted to rejoin the splintered wood. "Here," he said, gently taking the tools from her hands. "Let me show you." As he demonstrated the proper technique, their hands brushed, and Thomas felt a jolt of awareness course through him. Naomi's eyes lifted to his, a flush coloring her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. "You have capable hands, Mr. Calloway," she said softly. "Thomas," he corrected, suddenly unable to bear the formality between them. "Please call me Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, his name sounding different in her voice. "And I'm Naomi." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Then the wind howled against the cabin walls, breaking the spell and reminding them of the wilderness that surrounded their small haven. That night, a blizzard descended upon the mountains. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, driving snow through every crack and crevice of the cabin. Thomas added extra logs to the fire, concerned for Naomi's comfort. "Will the cattle be safe?" she asked, genuine worry in her voice. "They've taken shelter in the southern ravine," Thomas explained. "It's protected from the worst of the wind. The real danger is wolves. They get bold during storms." Naomi's eyes widened. "Shouldn't you check on them?" "Not until morning," Thomas said firmly. "No man survives a night in this kind of storm." The blizzard lasted 3 days, confining them to the cabin. In that forced intimacy, Thomas discovered new aspects of Naomi's character. Her quiet humor, her resourcefulness in stretching their provisions, her determination to learn everything about this new life. On the third evening, as they played cards by lamplight, Naomi asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Why did you send for a bride, Thomas? A man like you, young, capable, handsome, surely there were women in the territory who would have had you." Thomas set down his cards, knowing she deserved honesty. "There's a settlement 40 miles south with several eligible women. I've met them at gatherings." "And?" she prompted when he fell silent. "And I watched my father and mother build this place together," he finally said. "They were partners in everything. My father used to say my mother was the bravest person he knew, leaving everything familiar to create something new." He met her gaze directly. "I didn't want someone who was already settled here. I wanted someone who chose this life knowing its challenges. Someone with courage to match the land." Naomi's eyes softened. "You give me too much credit. It was as much desperation as courage that brought me here." "No," Thomas said with sudden conviction. "It takes courage to leave everything behind, to trust a stranger, to believe in possibilities." He hesitated before adding, "I've spent years telling myself that a man needs nothing but his own strength out here. But watching my cattle grow from a few to a herd made me realize some things aren't meant to be built alone." When the storm finally broke, Thomas rose before dawn to check the herd. The snow had drifted higher than a man's head in places, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. He saddled his most sure-footed horse and set out, concerned by the silence that greeted him. No lowing of cattle, no movement on the white expanse of the pasture. It took an hour of difficult riding to reach the ravine. What he found there stopped his heart. The snow had triggered a small avalanche, blocking the eastern exit. His cattle were trapped, and from the trampled snow and dark stains visible even from a distance, wolves had found them. Thomas spurred his horse forward, drawing his rifle as he approached. The wolves had withdrawn with daylight, but the damage was done. 3 of his best cows lay dead, partially devoured. The rest of the herd was pressed against the snow wall, wild-eyed with terror. Working frantically, Thomas began digging through the snow blockage, knowing he needed to get the cattle to open ground where he could defend them properly. The work was exhausting, and as the short winter day began to fade, he realized he wouldn't finish before dark when the wolves would return. The sound of another horse approaching made him spin, rifle ready. His jaw dropped at the sight of Naomi riding toward him, a second rifle balanced across her saddle. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, fear for her safety making his voice harsh. "It's dangerous." "You didn't return," she said simply, dismounting with more grace than he expected. "And you'll need help if you're going to save your herd." "Our herd," he corrected automatically, then felt his chest tighten at the smile that bloomed across her face. Together they worked until their hands were raw, cutting a path through the snow wall. As dusk approached, they heard the first howls echoing across the valley. "They're coming back," Thomas said grimly, passing Naomi his rifle. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me," she replied, checking the weapon with competent hands. "Though I've only hunted rabbits." "Stay on your horse," he instructed. "If they come, aim for the leaders. Don't waste shots." The wolves emerged from the tree line as the last light faded, gray shadows against the snow. Thomas counted 7 of them, a large pack driven by hunger to unusual boldness. They approached cautiously, aware of the humans, but drawn by the scent of the cattle and the previous night's kills. The first shot cracked across the valley as Thomas dropped the lead wolf. The others scattered, then regrouped, circling wider. When they charged from 2 directions, Naomi's rifle spoke, the bullet finding its mark in a large male. Her face was pale but determined as she reloaded. For 2 hours they held the wolves at bay, finally driving them off after killing 3 and wounding another. By then, they had cleared enough of the snow wall for the cattle to escape the ravine. Exhausted, they herded the surviving animals toward home, traveling slowly through the dangerous dark. "I've never been so frightened," Naomi admitted as they rode side by side, the cattle moving ahead of them. "You didn't show it," Thomas said, new respect in his voice. "You saved the herd." "We saved the herd," she corrected, then added softly. "You were right about building things together." When they finally reached the cabin, both were too exhausted for anything but falling into bed. Yet as Thomas prepared to retire to his room, Naomi caught his hand. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. for allowing me to help." The simple touch of her fingers around his wrist stirred something profound in Thomas. Not just desire, but a recognition that the woman before him possessed a strength he hadn't dared hope for. He'd advertised for a wife, expecting to find someone he would need to protect from frontier hardships. Instead, he'd found a partner. "I should be thanking you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Few women would have ridden out into that wilderness. Few men would have respected me enough to let me try," she countered. Their eyes held, and Thomas felt the last of his reservations begin to crumble. This woman had left everything she knew to forge a new life. She had faced wolves and blizzards without flinching. She had seen his modest homestead and recognized not its limitations, but its possibilities. As Christmas Eve arrived, Thomas rose early and disappeared into the barn. Naomi, busy preparing a special dinner from their limited stores, watched curiously as he carried armfuls of pine boughs into the cabin. "What are you doing?" she asked as he arranged the greenery along the mantel and wound it around the posts of her bed. "My mother always decorated for Christmas," he explained, slightly embarrassed. "Said it was important to bring life inside during the darkest days." Naomi's eyes softened. "My mother did the same. I didn't think," she trailed off, then admitted, "I didn't think we would celebrate." "We have much to celebrate," Thomas said quietly. "The herd survived. We survived. And you're here." That evening, they shared the best meal they could manage. Venison Thomas had saved for the occasion, potatoes from the root cellar, and a small cake Naomi had somehow created from their limited supplies. By lamplight, the decorated cabin felt almost magical, transformed from a frontier shelter into a home. "I have something for you," Naomi said when they had finished eating. She retrieved a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. A proper Christmas gift. Thomas unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound journal. Opening it, he discovered the first pages already filled with Naomi's neat handwriting. "It's an account of the cattle, their markings, ages, breeding history," she explained. "I've been asking questions and taking notes since I arrived. I thought it might help as the herd grows." Thomas stared at the practical gift, overwhelmed by the thought she had put into it. In 7 years of ranching, he had kept only minimal records, trusting to memory what should have been documented. "This is," he began, then had to clear his throat. "This is exactly what I've needed. Partners should contribute what they can," she said simply. Thomas reached beneath the table and brought out a wooden box he'd hidden there. "I have something for you as well." Naomi opened it to find a deed, the legal title to his homestead, amended to include her name alongside his. "Thomas," she breathed, understanding the significance immediately. "This is too much." "No," he said firmly. "It's what's right. If you choose to stay, to be my wife, everything we build will be ours together. Equal partners." Tears filled her eyes as she looked from the document to his face. "I've already chosen," she whispered. The confession hung between them for a heartbeat before Thomas stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. Taking her hands in his, he spoke the words he'd been holding back since she stepped off the train. "Naomi Lawson, will you marry me? Not because of an agreement or advertisement, but because I believe God sent you to me this Christmas as an answer to a prayer I was too stubborn to even admit I was making." "Yes," she answered without hesitation, her hands tightening around his. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Calloway." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, not to the cabin they shared, but to a truth he'd been running from for years. The frontier wasn't meant to be faced alone. Life's harshness was bearable when shared with someone whose courage matched your own. They were married on New Year's Day by a circuit-riding preacher who arrived just as they'd begun to worry the weather would prevent it. Neighbors from miles around made the journey despite the snow, curious to meet the woman who had captured the reserved young rancher's heart. As spring transformed the valley, Thomas and Naomi worked side by side to expand the cattle operation. Her vegetable garden flourished in the rich Montana soil. Together they built a larger barn and added 2 rooms to the cabin, one for the books that arrived monthly from Denver, and another, smaller one, in anticipation of children they both hoped would come. On the first anniversary of her arrival, Thomas brought Naomi to the highest ridge of their property. The valley spread below them, their cabin and barns tiny in the distance, their cattle dotting the lush summer pasture. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much we've built in 1 year," Naomi said, leaning against him as they surveyed their growing ranch. "I spent 7 years just surviving," Thomas replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "You taught me the difference between surviving and living." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the frontier that had once seemed so unforgiving, Thomas remembered his solitary Christmas wish the previous year, for the train to bring someone who could share his dreams. What he hadn't expected was that Naomi would expand those dreams beyond anything he'd dared hope for. The frontier hadn't changed. It was still harsh, demanding, and unforgiving of weakness. But Thomas had discovered that its challenges were met not by isolation but by connection, not by self-reliance alone, but by the strength found in building something together. When they returned to their cabin that evening, lamplight glowing in windows that now had proper curtains, Thomas paused to watch Naomi walk ahead of him. Her graceful figure, her determined step, her readiness to face whatever came. These were the gifts that had transformed his life when she stepped off that morning train, just as the Christmas season began. The woman who had traveled across a continent to meet a stranger had found not just a husband, but a partner. And the cowboy who believed the frontier allowed no room for love had discovered that the wildest country became home when you no longer faced it alone.